Hi everyone, so let's talk about the promises. Promises is a solution for asynchronous programming. Okay, asynchronous programming, whenever you are firing asynchronous call, then you can handle the response from the promises. So promises maintaining these different state like promises resolved, promises rejected, promise initial promise state. Okay, so whenever you are firing a backend call which is asynchronous request, you don't know when that request will get fulfilled. So the promise is something which can represent that asynchronous call. Whenever you got the response, then promise will return the resolved object. If that backend call is failed, then promise will return the rejected promise. So promises are other options for the asynchronous programming, and similar functionality is available in other language like deferred object. Okay, so if you talk about the Angular, there is a $q library is there to create the promises for the backend call which you are firing from the client side. You are just creating the promise deferred object. If the promise is resolved, it means you got the response from backend call, then you are resolving that deferred object, otherwise you are rejecting that. So the same kind of concept is now available with the ES6. There is a native promises are now available in the ES6, that is a deferred class. So from the backend request, you can return that deferred promise object. That promise object is now representing that asynchronous call. So there are only two different state which can be there, either a resolved or either a rejected state. So the first argument of the function call when the promise is fulfilled is a success callback. Okay. So promise dot then we are executing this then method is present on all the promises and takes two argument. Okay. One is a success callback, another is a failure callback. So success callback will get executed whenever the promise is resolved, or failure callback will executed when the promise is rejected. You can have a catch block also. So this is something, it look like something like this is the promise which is doing some asynchronous task, either reading the file, firing a network layer call, backend call, something like that. Then it is, if this call is returning a promise. Okay, so if this call is successful, it means it is returning the resolved promise, otherwise it is returning a rejected promise. So promise dot then is taking two different arguments, these two functions. First is success callback, another is a failure callback. Success will get executed whenever the promise is resolved. Okay, similarly this another method, you can write any number of methods. Promise dot then, you can do a chaining on the promise dot then you can also write promise dot then. So you can also create a chaining on the promises objects. So you can also write a catch method to catch the errors. Catch method is used same as dot then method when only the rejection handler is passed. So whenever we think that promise is going to reject and we are going to get some error, then we can catch this. So catch method is also behaving in the same way like dot then method, but it is only working as a handler for the rejected promises only. It is not catching anything which is being resolved or successfully you got the response. So creating the promises, new promises can be created by promise class. Create the constructor, create the object of that using new promise and pass these two callbacks, reject and resolve. This constructor accepts the single argument which is a function. So inside the constructor we are passing the function called the executor containing the code to execute when the promise is being executed. So this code is, let me directly go to that code only. So here we are creating the promise class, promise object. This is how we are creating the promise. I'm not talking about how to handle that. First we are talking about how to create a promise. So this read file is some kind of asynchronous operations, and this function is returning a promise object, new promise. This promise is taking one argument function object which is having the resolved and rejected state. So whenever you are able to execute this code successfully, you are resolving the promise, otherwise you are rejecting it. So this particular function, from wherever you are calling it, it is returning you either reject state of the promise, resolved state of the promise. Okay, so what we are doing, we are creating the promise read file example.txt. So we are calling this function, and this promise object will now have either rejected state or resolved state. So we can do a dot then on this only, promise dot then. Okay, so promise dot then first callback will get executed if we are able to get the resolved promise. If you are getting the rejected promise, then second callback, second function will get executed. So this is a simple example where we are creating the promise. Once we got the promise object, then we are checking if this is resolved or rejected using dot then method. Okay, promise dot then first will get executed when the promise is fulfilled, second will get promise is rejected. So there are different several ways of writing the promises using $q library. In the Node.js also there are Bluebird library, Van library, RSVP library are also there. A lot of libraries are there to handle these kind of write these kind of codes. Whenever you want to write the chaining, then you can do a chain of the promises like promise dot then, put these callbacks, then dot then, dot then, dot then. Inside the dot then just pass the function whatever you want to do. So every chain of the function is again returning the promise. So like promise dot then first chain, if that is being resolved, then only it will execute the second chain of the promise, then third chain of the promise. So you can do the chaining. If you want to execute these promises parallelly, then there is a method promise dot all. Okay, each call to that dot then or catch actually creates a returns another promise. That is an important thing. Every call whenever you are writing promise dot then is actually returning another promise. So after a single dot then you can also put another dot then, because that dot then is returning a promise, and you can write dot then method on the promise only. So promise dot then first function, dot then another function, dot then another function. So you can create actually the chain of the promises. So this is called a promises chaining. So this is about the promises. I'm covering these promises separately about the know how you are writing the promises in the Node, in the Angular, in the jQuery. There is a separate playlist for it, but you should have basic understanding for the asynchronous kind of programming. We are creating the promises, and promises are nothing but either a resolved state promise or rejected state of promise. Resolved means you got the response, now you can execute the first callback inside the then method. Okay, that's all. Thanks everyone.